So I did finally end up finding the Broadway with all the earphones and headphones on display. I must have walked past it yesterday, but there are actually a number of pretty interesting options in this display. So I'll just show you. So starting from the top, we have the usual kind of Beats selection headphones, including the special edition Hello Kitty version. But as we go down, we actually see some pretty interesting stuff. So for instance, we have a Sennheiser IE800 there. We have an AKG K550, a Shure SE846, and a bunch of other, kind of options for people in the know, including, as you can see, the Audio-Technica MSR7 in the limited edition red version. And yes, I'm definitely thinking of picking that up on the trip, though I may not do it until I've had a bit of a listen to it. Anyway, as you can see, the market for this kind of stuff is quite different than it is in Australia and I presume America. So, that's pretty cool. So, ta-da! I did pick up the MSR7 from Broadway for 2,280 Hong Kong dollars. It's pretty expensive. It's actually equivalent to about 360 Australian dollars, which is actually more than I would pay in Australia for this headphone, though it hasn't been released in Australia yet. But, this is a limited edition red version, so I thought I would snap it up while I had the chance. Now, I just wanted to show you the box just quickly because there's some interesting things on the box, particularly the idea that Audio-Technica is using a dual damping structure. So there's two separate chambers inside the headphone, which they say is to control resonance. Now, as far as I know, Audio-Technica hasn't actually used this structure before in any of their headphones except for the, extra bass line of headphones, or solid bass, sorry. Audio-Technica calls their bassy line the solid bass. So it's very interesting to see that kind of structure spread throughout their product line. And I believe it's not used in the Audio-Technica M50X, which is probably the MSR7's closest cousin in the lineup. Anyway, I'll just show you the headphone. I actually have been using this over the past few days. And as you can see, it's in the limited edition red with the gold trim. It's going to be pretty flashy for some people. I think it's quite in fitting with the whole, vaguely Chinese New Year theme of things. But, yeah, it is a very, very striking design. Now, I actually have the Sony MDR-1A here, which I brought with me to compare it directly to. And as you can see, they are very, very, very similar looking headphones. Surprisingly similar considering the fierce kind of rivalry between these two headphone firms. They are the number one and the number two in Japan, or might be number one and number two, I'm not absolutely sure. But they have a long history of kind of dueling it out in the Japanese domestic market. This is, as far as I know, Audio-Technica's first entry into the kind of high-end portable market. Around-ear high-end portable market, rather, because the ES10 is their portable on-ear flagship. Around-ear market, so it's surprising for them to basically just go out and make a very, very similar design to the Sony MDR-1R and the 1A. And when you think of, Beats and Yamaha and that kind of thing, you have to wonder if they're kind of tempting a lawsuit. But anyway, apart from the immediate visual impressions of these two headphones, there are some key differences in the design that are noticeable. First of all, the Audio-Technica is much, much heavier than the Sony, and that's actually immediately obvious when you pick them up. This is a 290 gram headphone versus a 225 gram headphone. And despite the fact that the Audio-Technica has thicker pads than the Sony, if you actually compare them, you can see that the Audio-Technica actually has thicker ear pads, just a bit slightly. The Audio-Technica is actually far less comfortable on the head, at least out of the box, than the Sony, because the Audio-Technica has a much stronger clamping force. It's a heavier headphone. Now, I'll have to kind of wait and see how it pans out over, more use. But first impressions out of the box, the Sony is a very, very comfortable headphone, and the Audio-Technica is not nearly as comfortable. I was using this headphone for a number of hours yesterday editing that previous Mongkok video, and I did notice that there was a hot spot forming at the top of my head, just at the headband here. Just a little point of discomfort, which was Not a big deal, but if you're going to wear these for hours and hours and hours, I might point you towards some more comfortable options. In terms of isolation, the Audio-Technica is actually much better than the Sony. It only has this one little port here, and then just what I believe might be a port. I'm not absolutely sure, but there's a port just here. But the actual kind of noise isolation that I've noticed is much better than it is on the Sony, which has the very large port here, and then I believe it might have no, okay, just forgot. Yeah, it's just got the one large port there. So noise isolation is better. The noise isolation on the Sony is pretty dismal, I have to say, but the Audio-Technica still has about average noise isolation. Now, there are some points of differences in terms of attention to detail that I think that Audio-Technica still really doesn't have their game on. The cable on the Audio-Technica is a pretty bad cable considering the price of this headphone. It has a lot of memory. It's kind of not the most supple kind of feeling cable in the world, and the kind of plug on the end is just a little, it's flashy and it's big, but it looks a little clumsy, I have to say, and it doesn't actually look all that durable because of all these kind of separate parts. The cable on the Sony is much more supple. It doesn't tangle. It's just a really nice cable. They worked on this design for quite some time. So, and then we have a nicer kind of plug on the end here. Sorry, so to get the focus on. This is a bit of a disappointment because the cable on the Audio-Technica is actually worse than the cable on the M50X. It's worse than the cable on the new IM50 line of earphones. So I have to wonder why Audio-Technica cable consistency is always so inconsistent. So I don't know. Some other things, I wish that Audio-Technica did copy Sony's angled cable outlet, just because this means that it brushes against the shoulder less when it's hanging on your side. This cable, because it's straight down, it brushes against your shoulder more. You end up with more cable noise on the Audio-Technica. Just a little thing. And in terms of other little build quality issues, the Sony is much nicer. Sorry, the Sony is much better damped in terms of its moving parts. It has, a bit of friction to all its movements. It just feels like a more premium sort of product. The Audio-Technica is a bit more squeaky, a bit more like the M50 in terms of its construction. So it feels like that Audio-Technica still doesn't quite get the luxury portable market. It's still kind of old school in its approach, and you can probably just tell immediately that that's the case just from the left and right earphone markings that Audio-Technica still uses with that serif romanized font. It is still, at heart, despite the kind of flashy design, a really old school kind of company. Now let's move into the actual sound comparisons. And again, the Audio-Technica's approach is really old school. And that's actually, I believe, a really good thing. It's a classic AT kind of headphone with the classic Audio-Technica house sound. So it sounds completely different from the Sony. It is a upper mid forward signature, particularly around female vocals and pianos. It's just a really gorgeous sounding headphone. Everything sounds really clean, sounds really, really tight, and has a nice wide soundstage. This is especially compared to the Sony, where the Sony has this really thick, this is the new Sony house sound, but it's got that thick mid-bassy sound, which isn't so bad in and of itself, but the Sony has a bass hump, particularly around 100 hertz or 90 hertz or something, where it sounds really kind of unbalanced or intrusive at times. When a bass note kicks in on the Sony, at times it just sounds completely disconnected from the rest of the signature when you're listening to bassy music. And it feels like with the Sony, someone decided, hey, I heard kids like bass these days, so let's take the normal kind of smooth, warm sound and just add a big smack of bass there. I don't really think it manages to pull it off completely successfully, though it is the best kind of, I guess, version of bass that Sony has produced so far, I guess. The MSR7 has less bass than the Sony, far less bass. It's a lot tighter though. It's really punchy. It's smooth and kind of balanced. It it never feels out of place, and it's not completely, you know, sort of lacking or anything like that, because it digs quite low. It's very tight. It's very well done. I like it more than the Sony in terms of bass. But if you're hoping for a lot of bass, you're going to be disappointed. Now, overall, the Audio-Technica does have a mid-forward sound, and for some people, it's so mid-forward that on some tracks, it is somewhat irritating, it is somewhat abrasive, especially at higher volumes when you're listening outdoors. When you have to turn up the volume, the Audio-Technica tends to sound a bit more harsh. This is in comparison with the Sony, where if you turn up the volume, even though the isolation on this headphone is quite poor, if you turn up the volume a lot, it still sounds, you know, very easy on the ears. So again, this is going to appeal to people who want a leaner kind of sound. This isn't to say that, like, I've read reports that say that the Audio-Technica is sibilant. I actually don't think it's sibilant so much, because the S kind of notes aren't that emphasized, at least to my ears, but overall the kind of mid-forward signature is more forward on this headphone. The treble on the MSR7 doesn't have the same kind of metallic shimmer to it that the M50X does, so that's going to be good news for a lot of people, because it sounds more natural in the higher frequencies than the Audio-Technica M50X. They're both more treble forward though than the Sony. The Sony has a relatively smooth kind of treble section. That isn't to say that it sounds muffled, because they both sound relatively nice and clear in the mids, but the Audio-Technica overall does sound like the cleaner, the leaner sounding headphone. Now, as I said, these are first impressions of the sound. I do like the sound of the Audio-Technica more. I think this is more the kind of classic profile that more people are going to enjoy, at least if you're after kind of like a balanced sound. This signature is actually kind of unique, because there's not that many portable around ear headphones that don't have that really super warm signature. This is much more of a leaner sort of option, and I think it's going to find a lot of fans. Now, that said, I'm not absolutely convinced that this is the best signature if you're going to do a lot of commuting or a lot of listening in noisy environments, just because if you do listen to like a lot of pop or a lot of bassy music, and also you're in a lot of noisy environments, this is probably going to get a bit fatiguing. Whereas the Sony or any other kind of option, there's a bunch of other options you could look at, like the Sennheiser Momentum or the you know, a whole bunch of other headphones you could look at that I think, you know, are going to deliver a bit more of a bass oomph that preserves itself in kind of noisy environments. That said, it's always interesting to compare two direct competitors, because these are just the two counterparts, and you can see that visually. I also had a look at the AKG K545 the other day, and I might try to pick that up while I'm still in Hong Kong, because there is a promotional price on that, and I think that might be able to bridge the gap a little between these two headphones. Anyway, it's nice to see that Audio-Technica is finally tackling the around-ear portable market, and I think this is a really convincing entry. I think this is going to find a lot of fans with its signature, but I will have to give this a lot more listening, and especially I have to take it back with me to Australia and compare it to some of the other around-ear portable headphones that I have on hand. But anyway, thanks for watching. Hope you guys are having a great start to the year. You can talk to me on Facebook at facebook.com/LachlanLikesAthing, or on Twitter at LachlanLikesAthing. Thanks to all my regular subscribers, and happy listening.